Sometimes a war doesn't begin with gunfire. It begins with confusion. How did two allies who fought side by side in World War II end up turning Korea into the first battlefield of the Cold War? Why did a small peninsula suddenly become the center of global attention? And how did a conflict that nobody wanted spiral into one of the most brutal wars of the 20th century? In this video, we're going to break down exactly how the Korean War started, what events triggered its explosion, and how the world got dragged into it. To understand the Korean War, we must go back to the end of World War II, when Japan surrendered in 1945. Korea, which had been under Japanese rule since 1910, suddenly found itself without a government, without a leader, and without a plan for the future. America and the Soviet Union rushed into the vacuum, not as enemies on Korean soil, but as uneasy partners pretending to cooperate. They needed a temporary solution, and so they drew an artificial line at the 38th parallel. Soviet forces took control of the north, and American forces took control of the south. No one imagined this line would later become one of the most dangerous borders in the world. In the north, the Soviets supported the rise of Kim Il-sung, a young guerrilla fighter who had been trained and armed by Moscow. He was charismatic, disciplined, and loyal to Stalin. In the south, the Americans backed Syngman Rhee, an older, Western-educated nationalist who dreamed of a strong, anti-communist Korea. Both men wanted the same thing, to rule all of Korea, and both were absolutely convinced they were the rightful leader of the entire peninsula. This was the seed of the war. Throughout 1946 to 1949, Korea became a mirror of the Cold War. The North built a powerful army with Soviet tanks, artillery, and Chinese support. The South struggled politically, facing protests, economic crises, and limited military supplies. The United States was more focused on Europe, believing the Soviets might target countries like Greece, Turkey, or West Germany. Meanwhile, Stalin and Mao encouraged Kim Il-sung's ambitions, and Kim repeatedly asked permission to invade the South. At first, Stalin hesitated, fearing American intervention. But in 1949, everything changed. The Soviets successfully tested their first atomic bomb. The Chinese Communists won their civil war. And the United States withdrew most of its troops from Korea, announcing that Korea was not included in America's defensive perimeter. Kim Il-sung believed the moment had come. He convinced Stalin that South Korea would collapse quickly, and that America would not intervene. Stalin finally approved the war, but with one condition: if the U.S. entered the conflict, North Korea would be on its own. Kim accepted the risk. Before dawn on June 25, 1950, the North Korean army launched a massive surprise invasion, crossing the 38th parallel with 135,000 soldiers, hundreds of T-34 tanks, and overwhelming firepower. The South Korean forces were caught completely off guard. They had no tanks, little artillery, and were scattered in defensive positions. Within days, city after city fell. Seoul collapsed almost immediately. Refugees flooded the roads, creating scenes of chaos that shocked the world. The United States, believing this invasion was part of a global communist plan, responded faster than anyone expected. President Harry Truman viewed Korea not as a local conflict but as a critical test of the West's resolve. If the U.S. allowed Korea to fall, would communists take Taiwan next, or Southeast Asia? Or even parts of Europe? Truman went to the United Nations, where the Soviets were boycotting a key meeting, allowing the UN Security Council to authorize military intervention. American forces, led by General Douglas MacArthur, were rushed to Korea. But the early days were disastrous. The North Korean advance seemed unstoppable. U.S. and South Korean forces retreated southward until they were trapped in a tiny pocket of land around Bisan, known as the Pusan Perimeter. It looked like Korea would fall within weeks. Newspapers around the world declared that the first major battle of the Cold War had nearly been lost. But what happened next changed the course of the entire conflict. MacArthur planned an audacious counterattack, unlike anything seen in modern warfare. He proposed a surprise amphibious landing at Incheon, far behind North Korean lines, a risky operation involving treacherous tides, narrow channels, and extreme odds. Military advisors called it too dangerous. Washington hesitated. But MacArthur insisted that this was the only way to cut off enemy supply lines and reverse the war. In September 1950, MacArthur's gamble paid off. The Incheon landing shocked the North Koreans, who suddenly found themselves surrounded. UN and South Korean forces broke out of the Pusan perimeter, while MacArthur's troops liberated Seoul. The North Korean army collapsed, retreating chaotically toward the north. Within weeks, momentum had completely shifted. Now the United States and South Korea pushed beyond the 38th parallel. Their new objective was to reunify Korea under a non-communist government. Truman approved the advance, believing that the war was almost over. But what they did not know was that China had already issued warnings. Mao Zedong declared that if American forces approached the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China, then China would intervene. MacArthur ignored the warnings. He believed China was bluffing, assuming they would not risk a full-scale war. But behind the scenes, hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers were already being moved into the mountains of North Korea, waiting for the right moment to strike. The surprise intervention of China in late 1950 changed everything. What had looked like a quick UN-South Korean victory suddenly reversed. Waves of Chinese soldiers, moving at night and using the terrain to their advantage, pushed UN forces back down the peninsula. Cities that had just been liberated were abandoned again. Seoul fell for the second time. The war had entered a phase of confusion, exhaustion, and political shock. Washington feared that pushing China too hard might trigger a much larger war, possibly involving the Soviet Union. Moscow, meanwhile, quietly supported China with equipment, advisors, and aircraft, turning the Korean skies into deadly arenas where Soviet-trained pilots fought American jets in battles the public barely knew about. By mid-1951, the front stabilized roughly around the 38th parallel, exactly where the whole conflict began. But this stabilization didn't mean peace. It meant something arguably worse, a grinding stalemate. Mountain ridges became fortresses, trenches stretched for miles, and both sides launched local offensives that killed thousands but changed almost nothing. It was a preview of the brutal positional warfare that would later shape Vietnam. Soldiers described the Korean terrain as frozen hell, burning hot in summer, numbingly cold in winter, and always filled with artillery fire. Every small hill had a name and a price in blood. Behind the battlefields, diplomats began negotiations for an armistice. But these talks were painfully slow. The main point of disagreement was the fate of prisoners of war. Many captured North Korean and Chinese soldiers refused to return home, fearing execution or punishment. The communist side demanded their return. The UN insisted on voluntary repatriation. Months passed, then years. Meanwhile, soldiers continued fighting and dying for hills that would be abandoned the moment peace was signed. For civilians, the war brought unimaginable suffering. Families were divided forever. Cities like Pyongyang, Seoul, and countless villages were bombed repeatedly. The U.S. Air Force dropped more bombs on Korea than it would later drop in the entire Vietnam War. Bridges, factories, dams, everything became a target. North Korea was almost completely destroyed from the air. Millions of civilians fled on foot, carrying only what they could hold. By the end of the war, Korea was one of the most devastated lands on Earth. Yet while soldiers fought and civilians fled, the global meaning of the conflict became increasingly clear. The Korean War was no longer just about unifying a peninsula. It had turned into the first real battlefield of the Cold War, the place where the United States and Soviet-aligned forces finally clashed indirectly. It set a pattern: proxy wars, ideological struggle, and the constant risk of escalation into nuclear conflict. In many ways, Korea was where the Cold War stopped being a political rivalry and became a violent reality. By 1953, both sides were exhausted. Stalin's death created a shift in Soviet policy, and China, having suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties, wanted the bleeding to stop. The United States had elected a new president, Dwight Eisenhower, who hinted even publicly that he might consider extreme measures if the war didn't end. Negotiations accelerated. Finally, on July 27, 1953, the armistice was signed. Fighting ceased. The DMZ was established, a narrow but heavily fortified strip dividing North and South Korea, and like that, A war that killed millions ended without a victory. No peace treaty was signed. Only a ceasefire. Technically, the war still hasn't ended even today. The long-term consequences were enormous. The Korean Peninsula became one of the most militarized places on Earth. Two nations with shared history, culture, and blood became locked in permanent hostility, one backed by the West, the other by communist powers. North Korea developed into one of the world's most isolated states. South Korea, with American support, transformed over decades into a technological and economic powerhouse. The global balance of power shifted as the United States strengthened alliances across East Asia, and China emerged as a major military actor. The Korean War also influenced future conflicts. Vietnam, Afghanistan, and many others would follow the same pattern of proxy struggles driven by ideology. But perhaps the deepest impact was psychological. The world learned that the Cold War wouldn't stay cold. Nuclear powers would push each other to the edge again and again, using other nations as battlegrounds. The fear shaped generations, policies, and military doctrines. And on the Korean Peninsula, families separated in the chaos of 1950 still wait for reunions more than 70 years later. The Korean War was often called the Forgotten War. But in reality, it changed everything: geopolitics, the Cold War, Asia's future, and the lives of millions. And its consequences continue to echo, because the conflict never truly ended. It simply froze in time, waiting.